Might as well start the show. Since we do have a lot of material to go through, and I do want to both be summary as possible, but also respect the value of this really rich history we're going to explore. We're going to leap over big swaths of time, and that's really the only way you could do it when you approach history from the standpoint of ideas and a battle of ideas. The linear aspect of time is not really something you can respect, because that's not how it works. You know, you can go through hundreds or even thousands of years sometimes of very slow changes in history, dark age processes, rampant ignorance, and then all of a sudden you get these explosions of change, of singularities, of brilliant minds, of artists that appear on the scene. You tend to have other anomalies like population explosions as well, both in terms of a society's ability to support more people as well as a higher standard of living, higher quality of life. These are things which materialists, people approaching their search of history from a material or mechanistic standpoint, they never quite fully understand what's really going on. And I think the benefit of our approach here with the Rising Tide Foundation and people who we collaborate with, the reason why we resonate together is that we have recognized in various ways through our own unique paths that it is more valuable to look at the effects, the shadows of changes called history that we chart on timelines and we can like label as events or wars or peace treaties. But it's better to find the causality outside of that material sequential domain and locate it in the higher domain of ideas. And as Martin Luther King said very eloquently, that even though history is a struggle between good and evil ideas, the longer arc does bend towards justice, that there is not a perpetual positive, negative, darkness and light pulling and pushing at each other with equilibrium. There is a higher convergence towards justice and principle. We're now coming off of a series of 7 weeks of lectures, which began with a lecture on St. Augustine in defense of Platonic Christianity. It took us through the battles of people like Socrates, of Cicero, who fought to defend the principles of the republics of Athens and of Rome. It took us through the Chinese cultural matrix, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and it looked at the Jewish world, the Islamic world, and all the points of common convergence of principle, as well as common places where mistakes were made. The same categories of mistakes were made in each of the cultural matrices, to get a sense of like, what is this thing we call dark age processes and Renaissance processes? How does it express itself politically? Today, this is sort of like a preamble, a prelude to a new cycle, which will begin next Sunday, or this coming Sunday, with Anton Chaikin, who's a renowned historian. He's written multiple books, from the Treason in America book to the unauthorized biography of George Bush in the 90s that exposed, I think most publicly and for the first time, the Nazi connections of the Bush family and the entire Vorburg, Bank of England machine that was behind the Nazi Party. Anton is in the midst of publishing a new book, and that will be coming out in a couple of months, and he's going to give us sort of an introduction to it, which will sort of spark the new cycle. I'm going to just I'm going to do a little screen share here, because I want people just to see hold on, share. Okay, so just so people can go on our website and see the lecture cycle. I'm assuming everyone can see this. We used a painting of Joseph Wright of Derby as the banner for Harmony of Interests, Inquiries into the True Nature of the American System. And like I said, today is sort of a prelude. Since it is Canada Day, I couldn't resist a little lecture on Canada and use it as an opportunity to give people a better sense of what was this thing called America. What was this American process that we chose to stay out of when the opportunity arose? Oh, hold on. I'm hearing some voices here. Okay, I guess they put themselves on mute. So every single Sunday, starting this coming Sunday, there will be a presentation on different aspects of America as it truly is and was meant to be, but was never permitted to fully blossom and take the form that its founders intended. The reason why we chose this beautiful painting by a British painter, Joseph Wright of Derby, is that it does get at the essence that America was more than just a thing localized within the 13 colonies. It wasn't just something that was designed to take over from the British Empire as a new empire. It was designed around, if you look at the founders, the thoughts, the ideas that animated the sacrifices and the risks that were taken by the network of people around the world, not just in America, that led up to and expressed itself in the 1776 Declaration of Independence. You find that there was an understanding that the value of society and that the cause of laws does not come from a sovereign, from the arbitrary will of that who finds themselves in the most powerful position in society. It's not that, but rather than the human mind, in the mind's ability to ponder, to wonder, and to seek after causes, and to grapple with paradoxes. So I think that this painting called The Philosopher's Lesson, featuring an astronomy lesson, obviously, with people of all ages in that wonder, I think this painting encapsulates that idea of value that defined the best of constitutional America and what is currently arising with this new multipolar alliance. You can really only understand the historic power of what this is by looking at this deeper America that is so often overlooked and has been largely scrubbed out of our history books for reasons that you can all think about on your own and figure out the correct answer to. I'm going to share another thing here as I begin. Share. Oops. Okay. Come on. Okay, can people see the screen right now?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I changed the name of this class last minute. I'd written a couple of articles today, 2 articles in celebration of Canada Day. And that caused me to change my focus a little bit. A couple of weeks ago, I gave a class called Canada and the Mischance of 1867 that dealt with the Alaska Purchase, where Russia sold America, the United States, Alaska in 1867. It was also a year where the British North America Act was passed that solidified on the continent a nation defined by being in the interest of the British Empire, as it says in that 1867 Constitution. And the power that was in the hands of pro-Lincoln Canadians who had political power and were moving quickly to use Lincoln's victory as a way to declare independence from the British, they were overthrown during the end of the Civil War and before this opportunity to unite America with Russia with rail was really taken, which would have involved British Columbia as a part of that process. A series of coups, assassinations were waged, stemming from 1867. In one of my 2 articles on the creation of a synthetic nationalism in Canada as a way to maintain a wedge between, sorry, I'm just playing with the, sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the, okay, sorry, the screens where I'm seeing people's faces is in front of the words I want to read. Okay, so this is Lord Mackinder. Lord Mackinder was in Canada in 1909 with Lord Halford Mackinder. Sorry, this is Lord Milner, and he was here in Canada with Lord Halford Mackinder together, one representing the Round Table movement of Cecil Rhodes, the other representing the Fabian Society, both think tanks having been created in order to restore a new British Empire and undo the dangers of a US-Russia German collaboration, which was also expressing itself in China with the revolution being led by Sun Yat-sen around the same time. Looking upon the world situation, Milner said, especially regarding Canada, He said, as between the three possibilities of the future, one, closer imperial union, two, union with the US, and three, independence, I believe definitely that number two is the real danger. I do not think the Canadians themselves are aware of it. They are wonderfully immature in political reflection on the big issues and hardly realize how powerful the influences are. On the other hand, I see little danger to ultimate imperial unity in Canadian nationalism. On the contrary, I think the very same sentiment makes a great many, especially of the younger Canadians, vigorously and even bumptiously assertive of their independence, proud and boastful of the greatness and future of their country, and so forth, would lend themselves, tactfully handled, to an enthusiastic acceptance of imperial unity on the basis of partner states. This tendency is therefore, in my opinion, rather to be encouraged, not only as a safeguard against Americanization, but as actually making, in the long run, a union for all the Britons. So I think that this is one of the most insightful ways to start this sort of class, because again, Milner and Mackinder were looking very much at the right causal mechanisms of world history, and they were both very happy that the Canadians were wonderfully immature in understanding the big issues and the big influences. They thought that this was great, how simple these Canadians were, and how, if tactfully handled, a form of Canadian independence could be created that would protect British possessions in the Americas from Americanization. Now, people are thinking, well, they might think, well, that's not such a bad thing. I mean, look at NAFTA. That certainly wasn't a great thing for Canada or for the United States, for that matter. Just a bunch of US-based corporations gobbled up Canadian industry and outsourced everything to cheap labor markets. That wasn't good. Well, this is not the same thing. This is 1909. He's writing this, and he's looking at a Zollverein. I mean, there was a real movement led by Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the Canadian Prime Minister, to create a Zollverein of the North Americas, to put a protective tariff around the Americas and to create a condition of industrial growth built on free trade within the continent. But it was defined by a very different America from the one that we've known in the last 50 or so years, especially since JFK was assassinated. This was an America that was still a holder of the traditions in a living way of people like Abraham Lincoln, of McKinley, of Garfield, who were all assassinated for their resistance to British operations in America, called Wall Street, and their commitment towards industrial progress and the elimination of slavery and the elimination of poverty, both in America and also internationally, which is a very important factor that we'll touch again on our class. Without going into this Union for all the Britons, keep in mind as well as we go through this, just to hold a bit of the future, because we're going to jump into the past soon. This imperial union that the Round Table was set up to advance expressed itself in the League of Nations, which was the first attempt in a serious way of world government. At the time, some of Laurier's collaborators were still in power. They came back to power in Canada, even though Laurier himself was ousted by this group that I go through this in my new paper on the Vineyard of the Saker. But his allies came back to power, the Laurier liberals, and led in breaking and sabotaging this, along with patriots in America. So this is to say, okay, what are these longer sweeps of history? Okay, well, in 1867, I already brushed on this. What we had was a growth process that I mentioned with tying to U.S.-Russia alliance collaboration. Keep in mind, Russia had also saved America in 1863 in the Civil War by sending their fleets to the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. That was a direct sign to the British and French imperial orders to stay out of an open assistance of the Confederate South. And that did save, arguably, the United States from dissolution. The momentum of extending Lincoln's transcontinental railway up the Pacific coast through British Columbia into Alaska, where it would ultimately connect with the Trans-Siberian Railway being made with the help and guidance of Lincoln economists and Lincoln allies like Sergei Witte, the transport minister and later prime minister of Russia. This was very important. Internationally, the system that America represented was being applied, and everywhere it was being applied, you were seeing industrial explosions of growth. You were seeing banking, local national banking that was free of the Rothschild, the City of London influences. And the empire knew that it would not be able to last, especially as overland development was destroying their monopoly on sea trade, and the choke points they maintained around the world, from the Straits of Gibraltar to around the world. You could look at maps of the British Empire, and it becomes clear how overland rail development and industrial growth internally was dismal. So this is what Milner is reacting to. William Gilpin wrote in his Cosmopolitan Railway, which is where I got that low resolution image from, of his what today would be called the World Land Bridge, as it's been defined by the Schiller Institute. I like some of its graphs and program. I think there's a lot to learn from that. But it really was first put out by William Gilpin, the first governor of Colorado, who I've written quite a bit about, and also Lincoln's bodyguard, who was the champion internationally of this process. And Gilpin said in 1890, railways continue to extend themselves, soon to become a universal system over the lands of the globe. We have seen the energies of the American people bringing into line and into use these new powers span their continent with Pacific railways, as with the rapidity of lightning from a mountain loud. Availing themselves of the favorable thermal warmth upon the plateau and upon the immediate seacoasts, bathed in the Asiatic Gulf Stream, they will continue to expand their work to Bering Straits, where all the continents are united. This will extend itself along similar propitious thermal selvage to the oriental Russian coasts into China. To prolong this unbroken line of cosmopolitan railways along the latitudinal plateau of Asia to Moscow and to London will not have long delay. The less significant and isolated continents of the southern hemisphere, South America, Africa, and Australasia, will be reached by feeders through the Panama, Suez, and the chain of oriental peninsulas and islands. The whole area and all the populations of the globe will thus be united and fused by land, travel, and railway. So again, very, very strong idea, very much accepted and promoted even by Tsar Alexander III and Tsar Nicholas II, who had even gone so far in 1906 as to commission a feasibility study, paying American engineers to go to the Bering Straits and actually conduct a study on the Bering Strait rail tunnel. This is something which Russia has revived again in 2007, 2011. This is part of the Polar Silk Road. So again, I want people to think about today's world and the future world as we're looking at the futures that could have been, but were sabotaged artificially through things like this. But this itself, it wasn't the first time Canada was offered an opportunity to break free of the British Empire. There was a time even before this that we came close. And this is what I'd like to sort of develop a little bit today on Canada Day. In future classes in this coming lecture cycle, it will be brushed upon and light will be shed on different aspects of this picture, so that for those who do make it through the next 8-week cycle, or at least as much of it as possible, I think that a pretty strong image of world history and our future will be clear in the mind. Okay, so when was the first time that this process availed itself to Canada? Okay, so for those who are not aware, I myself was a little shocked when I saw a news piece on CTV a little while ago featuring a stamp that was being ushered in with Benjamin Franklin's face on it. It was a 250-year memorial stamp commemorating the founding of Canada Post. And I remember in 2006, I wasn't very political yet, but I was aware of some starting to become aware of some ugly processes of world history. And this was an anomaly for me. Why was Ben Franklin on our stamp? And when you start digging into it, you discover that, well, he was the founder of Canada's Postal Service in 1753, which he again revolutionized as Deputy Postmaster General. He literally revolutionized the first lines from Halifax into Quebec City, into Montreal, that for the first time ever really expanded the idea of what the outside world was to the majority of people of Quebecois living in that French colony. So he was the founder of Canada's Postal Service. And below, I don't know if can people see the images below, or are the videos covering it?
I can see him below.
Okay. So what we have here below is, again, a picture of Ben Franklin with, on the right is Fleury Mesplat, who is a French collaborator, a printer who was also a like-minded spirit who he recruited and brought to the Americas, and who set up the first newspaper in Canada called the Montreal Gazette, which was officially set up in 1778. What you have there is a letter to the inhabitants of the province of Quebec extolling upon them. This is something that Fleury Mesplat printed and was used to try to organize the patriotic, more forward-thinking members of the society of Quebec to become a member of the 13 other colonies who were declaring independence from the crown. Keep in mind, Quebec was still a seigneurie, a largely feudal society. It was run by institutions that had gone back quite a long while. The church was a much greater political influence in French Canada than it was in the United States, in the English colonies. But so there was a lot of effort for a couple of years to bring Canada, for more than a couple of years, for decades really, if you think about it, to bring Quebec into the fold as a kindred spirit and collaborator, and it didn't work. In 1776, Ben Franklin was here in Montreal for 2 weeks. The Americans had already taken control of Montreal, but they had failed for a number of reasons to take control of Quebec, which was sort of the greater seat of power in those days. Ben Franklin was deployed here on a mission by the Continental Congress in order to win support of the colonies, or to get Quebec to join, like I said. He was given, there's a longer list of instructions. I pulled out two that I think are just useful, where the Congress informs him, or instructs him in February 1776. He arrives here, keep in mind, in April, the end of April 1776. And the Declaration of Independence is signed on the 2nd and made public on the 4th of July. Now, he's given the instructions: inform them, the Quebecois, that in our judgment, their interests and ours are inseparably unified, that it is impossible we can be reduced to a servile submission to Great Britain without their sharing in our fate. And on the other hand, if we obtain, as we doubt not we shall, a full establishment of our rights, it depends wholly on their choice whether they will participate with us in those blessings or still remain subject to every act of tyranny, which British ministers shall please to exercise over them. Urge all such arguments as your prudence shall suggest to enforce our opinion concerning the mutual interests of the two countries, and to convince them of the impossibility of the war being concluded to the disadvantage of the colonies, if we wisely and vigorously cooperate with each other. To convince them of the uprightness of our intentions towards them, you are to declare that it is our inclination that the people of Canada may set up such a form of government as will be most likely, in their judgment, to produce their happiness. And you are, in the strongest terms, to assure them that it is our earnest desire to adopt them into our union as a sister colony, and to secure the same general system of mild and unequal laws for them and for ourselves, with only such local differences as may be agreeable to each colony respectively. Okay. So what we know, and I mean, Ben Franklin made a point that, and the arguments were made because the Quebecois were very insecure about losing their culture, their Catholicism, their language, and he made a point: look at the Swiss cantons, where you have Protestants and Catholics coexisting in harmony. This is not unprecedented, and I think that if it were done at the time on principle, it would have been a very, very different history that would have unfolded for the next 250 years. Now, what we do know is that it was only 2 weeks before that mission that Ben Franklin put himself on, and that a big chunk of his life was devoted to making this happen. He declared that this was not the right time. It was impossible in 1776 for this to happen. There was no, though you had sympathy with the peasants who were very much in favor of the U.S. The cause of the rebels in the South, there was no support he could find among the elite, among the political or religious elite, and the problem of the population was there are several layers to this, which we're going to I'm not going to say exactly what it was, but based on we'll get back to this at the end. It'll make more sense. But we didn't accept this offer. Instead, Quebec and later English Canada, after the revolution caused a flood of United Empire loyalists, accepted a different type of government based upon submission to crown and the abolishment of any hopes for representative assembly. What we do know is that in 1791, again in 1840, and again in 1867, acts were passed to sort of codify as a substitute for our Constitution certain rights that were enumerated, but it was always done with the idea that the British Empire's interests were primary to the general welfare, and that a deep state structure of the Privy Council, of governor generals, lieutenant governors, and other appointees unelected by the people would be the ultimate controlling hand above any part of an elected assembly. The Declaration of Independence, it's a beautiful document. I think it's worth reading. It was not just Jefferson who wrote this. I would say that was probably a little bit of propaganda, because Jefferson was a powerful political agent at the time and who was needed to be on the American cause. But if you look at it, it was a committee of 4 under the control of Benjamin Franklin that drafted this thing. Jefferson, when under the influence of under the influence of Benjamin Franklin, did do good things, but left to his own devices, the guy was a disaster. And I think that it's a bit of a mistake to just associate this declaration with that one guy who loved slaves and a lot of other degenerate things. So again, to put the proper understanding of Ben Franklin's role in this in place, I think we could now read the first little bit of that declaration, where for the first time in world history, a society is set up that's based upon certain principles that had never been acted upon ever before. They had always remained in the realm of ideas, but never actualized as real social organizing processes. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Let's compare that to what Canada ended up getting. This is the Declaration of Independence. Now, the preamble of the British North America Act, our own sort of constitution, it's worth reading a few of the opening pages of this thing, but it's a very different idea. Nick, you want to read it?
Whereas the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have expressed their desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. And whereas such a union would conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is a very different beast. Not promote the interests of the general welfare, which is what you get in the U.S. Constitution. That was also led largely in its preamble by Ben Franklin at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. But you have here an idea of the British Empire and the interests of the crown. If you look at even our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, made much more recently in 1982, even that act, which is just an addendum to the British North America Act, is very clear that our liberties and freedoms are something granted to us by the sovereign. They're not something that are recognized as inalienable. They're not legitimized by the consent of the governed. They are given to us by a hereditary power, and implicitly can be taken away because they're not really true. They're just there as a social convention to keep order. So these two ideas, I think that one of the best people to speak on them, whose life overlapped that of Benjamin Franklin, and who in many ways was a very, very kindred spirit as a scientist, poet, tragedian, who fought, and philosopher, who fought his entire life to create the conditions whereby a proper revolution could occur without it becoming a Jacobin bloodbath, as he was looking at France in dismay at the heads roll of all the leaders and the scientists who had largely been organized by Ben Franklin earlier, and who led in making the American Revolution a success. I'm going to speak more about this later. By the time the 1789 opportunity arose in France, which was supposed to be a springboard for other nations of Europe to break free of monarchical systems, it turned into a total color revolution, steered from the City of London and the British Foreign Office. I've written a paper about this. I'm going to put this in the description of this video on YouTube for those who want to look into that story. But Schiller was looking at dismay and put a lot of his work into ensuring that the reasons why the society was turned into that Jacobin mob, how to diagnose that, and then how to solve that. Again, without saying the full answer why, because I want that to be more implicit in the course of this presentation, his Universal History lectures, which started in 1789 in the University of Jena, dealt with different aspects of this. And I think that one extract from his comparative investigation of Solon's Athens versus Lycurgus's Sparta is very interesting, comparing two different types of constitutions and two different types of states, and without passing any obvious judgment, you can very clearly see which one his heart is in tune with. And he comes out towards the end of his lecture saying, Jerry, do you want to read Schiller?
Okay. The one that's on the screen, right?
You got it.
Okay, I hear a bit of an echo when I talk.
I have an idea. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Is it better now?
I'll try.
Okay. Just plug your ears and talk if you need to.
Yeah, I won't listen to myself.
Okay.
The state itself is never the purpose. It is important only as the condition under which the purpose of mankind may be fulfilled. And this purpose of mankind is none other than the development of all the powers of people, i.e., progress. If the constitution of a state hinders the progress of the mind, it is contemptible and harmful, however well thought out it may otherwise be. In general, we can establish a rule for judging political institutions that they are only good and laudable to the extent that they bring all forces inherent in persons to flourish, to the extent that they promote the progress of culture, or at least not hinder it. This rule applies to religious laws as well as to political ones. Both are contemptible if they constrain a power of the human mind, if they impose upon the mind any sort of stagnation. A law, for example, by which at a particular time appeared to it most fitting, such a law were an assault against mankind, and laudable intents of whatever kind were then incapable of justifying it. It were immediately directed against the highest good, against the highest purpose of society.
Good. Yeah. I think that this standard is just so invaluable when navigating through the minefield of world history and all of the misinformation that's been planted in this minefield to misdirect us and cause us to pass wrong judgments on moments of change in history. I think this standard of a legitimate state and one that has, I guess you could say from the Confucian language, fallen out of the mandate of heaven, or that has lost the mandate of heaven, is really where the powers of the mind are stagnant, are induced to stagnate. That's where you have contemptible laws, contemptible nations, to the degree that, and as he says, they were an assault against mankind, but they're laudable intents of whatever kind, no matter how good the intention was. If the effect is stagnation of mind and stagnation of the nation, then you have something which is ultimately self-destructive. It is entropic. It is always going to consume more energy than it produces. It's going to wind down, and you're always going to need greater degrees of fascism, top-down tyrannical control to maintain what you might call order in the state. If progress is made and you have the development of the innate powers within a people, then you actually have something you can work with. It's an alignment with natural law. And I'm just saying this here because, especially in our day and age, it's where postmodernist education theories have really distorted people's ability to judge qualitatively what is mind, what is justice, what is a state, even what its purpose. These are all very scrambled ideas, and it's causing people to ultimately rebel against things they don't fully understand, as we see with the chaos of Black Lives Matter and other modern Jacobin movements that are being that are channeling people who are maybe honest people locally. Many of them are just people who are fed up, but they don't have, like the French peasants of the 1790s, they don't have the cultivated mindset. The wisdom has not been honed to judge whether they're being played as instruments by a higher will, or are they their own agencies? Are they themselves sovereign actors? Which is again vital if you're going to have a constitutional republic. Every sovereign, every person is sovereign. You don't have one sovereign. You have everybody who's sovereign. Does that mean that they're all perfect and that they're these fixed, crystallized, finished products? No, not at all. But it does mean that there's an orientation towards perfectibility that has to be in the will of all of the parts of that nation. So I think that now's a great time to look at Benjamin Franklin, because nobody, I think, in recent history best embodied that characteristic as the citizen, the sovereign citizen, as Benjamin Franklin, a man who, with a grade 3 education, his parents could not afford to give him anything more than a grade 3 education before he was put in as an apprentice in a candle making factory of his father's. Not a factory, just a workshop. He became one of the most potent forces that humanity has yet produced. And so the entire 60-year period before the American Revolution, it can't be understood without recognizing his role within it. And when people think of Benjamin Franklin, they think of many things because he wore many hats. Obviously, one major role he played was as a printer. That was how he made a lot of his wealth, how he made a lot of his reputation, how he conducted a lot of his political organizing, both in America as well as in Europe. So that's one image. Another image is, as we already brought up, the father of the founding fathers, the man who, though was never elected to any position within the new government of America, organized the entire process. He had help, but this guy was the spark plug, and he was there all the way from the Declaration to the Treaty of Paris to the Constitutional Convention signing. And he was a force. So people often think of him in that way. This is a 1940 painting of the Constitutional Convention, with him there sitting in the middle, and Alexander Hamilton to his right side. Other people think of him as an inventor, as a discoverer.
Matt, who was to his left side?
I don't know.
Was that Jefferson whispering in his ear?
No, to his right side, to our left, is Alexander Hamilton.
Right, so the guy
whispering.
whispering in his ear is Hamilton.
That's Hamilton, yeah.
Okay. So maybe the guy in the red jacket is Jefferson.
The guy, all I know is the guy standing up is obviously George Washington. I'm not as good as Jerry probably is as the other faces, but
maybe the guy on the left of Washington is John Adams.
Yeah, well, certainly everyone's taking turns now signing their John Hancock, I'm sure, is one of them. Oh no, that's the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, I do. Point is, that's another image of Ben Franklin. Another one is the discoverer of electric fire from the heavens. This is a painting made by one of his close allies, a British painter named Benjamin West, who was himself a very unique figure who lived most of his life in Britain, ironically, but was a strong Republican his entire life, and who was actually the guy who founded the Royal Academy of the Arts in London. He organized King George III himself to sponsor and become the patron of the Royal Academy, and all of the great American painters of the 19th century that created the Hudson River School all studied in London under Benjamin West. Benjamin West did this very, very Promethean rendition of Ben Franklin. Little angels, obviously metaphorical for the divine act he had been recognized to have committed by discovering the nature of electricity and then harnessing it, which you see in the background is one of Ben Franklin's experiments. I mean, so you were able to, with that idea of electricity, he was able to then create new inventions using that idea that would then help test out what its nature is in greater detail to be used to protect humanity. In the case of lightning rods that he invented is a great example. And so people often think of him as this. And he was known across Europe as the Prometheus of America, who trumped all of the Royal Academies of Sciences in Europe and the greatest minds of the age, who were all trying and failing to really harness electricity as an idea and apply it. They couldn't do it. He did. And this was a real mind blower that made him an international sensation. I think it's very important here to keep in mind that Ben Franklin never saw his discovery of electricity as in any way separate from his work on natural law and politically. In his mind, these were two sides of the exact same thing. More to be said on that. I wanted to just do a quick little assessment because he did so much and we can't go over it all. A little overview of his life is, I think, worth it just to hold it in as a one. But yeah, so Ben Franklin, I mentioned discoveries, inventions. He invented the bifocals, fun things like the glass harmonica, an instrument which Mozart was so charmed by when he heard it that he composed several pieces of music to it. In 1791, same year that the French Revolution was beginning to turn into a bloodbath, Mozart did this. And Mozart, keep in mind, a lot of his music and the networks of collaborators that he kept were very much a part of the Ben Franklin Republican network. His operas, like the Magic Flute, for example, cannot be understood without an understanding of the political dynamics of this new age of mankind that was being brought online. That the greatest artists and scientists were in tune with, because what made them great wasn't that they had a great sense of mathematics or great musical ear, but rather because they tuned their own inner souls to the external harmonies of nature that allowed them to make discoveries. So, the rocking chair, I said the lightning rod. Ben, in 1775, on a way back from Britain to America, Ben Franklin discovered the Gulf Stream, which cut transportation times from the Atlantic to the Pacific. From Europe to the Americas by 2 weeks by discovering this Gulf Stream. Terms in electricity like battery, charge, and conductor, or even electrify, were all created by Ben Franklin. As far as social improvements, he created the first fire department of Pennsylvania in 1736, the first public library, 1731 in Pennsylvania, founded the University of Pennsylvania and other social organizations. Internal improvement groups were set up under him that led into better sewage systems being created in roads. I want to say something quickly here. 1725, this is a very, very confusing thing for a lot of people today. He's deployed to England to perform counterintelligence on the London Hellfire Club. This is something which, for those who want to dig into that story a little bit more, I'll say a few more words on that because it is juicy. People see this book here in front of me? Can people see me? No, eh?
Yes.
Hold it up
Okay.
again.
Yeah.
This book
Oh, yeah.
is How the Nation Was Won by Graham Lowry, America's Untold Story from 1630 to 1754. This is something you can buy online. It's also available, I believe, on archive.org. Valuable book that goes through what Benjamin Franklin was doing, because people often attack him for being like this Freemasonic hellfire Satanist, because, yeah, you know, when he was in London as a young man, 17, 18 years old, he did go deep. He was deployed as a printer, as a cover story, but he was deployed to conduct intelligence on what the hell was going on in the core of London. And he writes a little bit about that inferentially in his autobiography. But he never really puts on paper, because he's conducting sensitive operations his entire life, from the moment that he's recruited to Cotton Mather's networks as a young man, delivering candles made by his father to Cotton Mather's house, and his talent was soon identified by Mather, by the Winthrops, who were the Republican leaders that go back to the 1630s. He was quickly discovered to be a great mind, a great young man who went to their library, voraciously read, and was very much influenced by their writings. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. Early on, as he was working for a local tyrant who happened to be his older brother, James Franklin, who ran the biggest printing press this is Massachusetts here. His older brother is accused and is discovered to have been the founder of a local Massachusetts Hellfire Club, which were being set up all across the colonies. The Hellfire Club, what was this? This was set up in 1718, at a time when Gottfried Leibniz had just died in 1716. The Hellfire Clubs were set up as a new satanic organizing tool across Britain, but also through the colonies. Robert Walpole was the prime minister. The heart and soul of the clubs, as Ben Franklin calls him in his autobiography, was Bernard Mandeville. And this was a deep corrupting influence, and also Sir John Churchill, the Lord of Marlborough, who was part of the Venetian faction that led in the takeover of Britain in the 1688 Glorious Revolution, which set up the Bank of England. These groups, he was a deep part of this. It's kind of like, if you think about the, what's her name? Marina Abramovich. If you think about some of these nasty things that we've recently had a chance, some of us, to look into regarding these networks that are doing spirit cooking and all these things. This is not a new practice. This is something that was done then, and there are some sordid descriptions in history books on the types of activities that were done in these hedonistic clubs. So all that to say, Increase Mather, John Winthrop, Cotton Mather, these people were they were waging a major cultural warfare against this operation that was coming in to the Americas. Ben Franklin was uniquely positioned as the younger brother and the apprentice working in his older brother's print shop. And soon he was deployed, like I said, in 1725 to London to get a better sense of this brand new organization. What was it? What was their intention? How did they operate? And he did profiling. So this is a very interesting thing that a young man would go through. It's kind of remarkable that he came out of that in one piece. So, you know what? Actually, let me do a quick little segue on this, because I think it is just so important. Let me just throw in a slide. I wasn't originally going to do a set of slides, but I will. So, Ben Franklin, just to get across this Cotton Mather connection, he writes in his autobiography that in 1771, which was written to organize his son, who was unfortunately at that time a member of the Hellfire Clubs before the American Revolution. He'd been recruited in the 1750s when he brought his son, bad decision in hindsight, to London. And his son, I guess the British got their revenge on Franklin by recruiting his son, who became a loyalist enemy of the revolution. But he tried hard to organize his son, and wrote his autobiography as a manual to help his son in any way he could morally. And he wrote at one point about this period, saying that an influence on my conduct throughout life For I have always set a greater value on the character of a doer of good than on any other kind of reputation. And if I have been, as you seem to think, a useful citizen, the public owes the advantage of it to that book. What is, just to get a sense of that book, this is Essays to Do Good. That's Cotton Mather. He died in 1720. I just picked a couple of little sections I liked from the book. It's again available on archive.org or on the Rising Tide Library of Alexandria. You guys can see these things in their PDFs. Cotton Mather wrote, "It is an invaluable honor to do good. It is an incomparable pleasure. A man must look upon himself as dignified and gratified by God when an opportunity to do good is put into his hands. He must embrace it with rapture as enabling him to answer the great end of his being." And then a little further on, he writes about government. "Government is called the ordinance of God. Thus, it should vigorously pursue those noble and blessed ends for which it is ordained, the goodness of mankind." So this is 1710. Leibniz is still alive. I'm going to say a few words about Leibniz shortly. But sorry. John, keep in mind, John Winthrop Jr. corresponded with Leibniz directly, and a few words, yeah, I'm not going to say it yet, but shortly I will. Oops.
I think so.
People are often a little bit confused because at this time there was no America, right? There was just Britain and its colonies. Everyone saw themselves as British, whether you were part of the Bernard Mandeville Hellfire Club circle or whether you were a Benjamin Franklin or a Winthrop, you saw yourself as British. The question was, just like today, it's too simplistic to say America is this. America is an empire. You know, that's usually what a lot of people do, and they don't realize that there's two Americas, just like there's two Britons. What was the Britain that Cotton Mather and Ben Franklin saw themselves defending and seeing needing to revive? I selected here just a few representatives, noble representatives of this better Britain that sort of stemmed from the work of Henry VII, the first sort of, or the world's second leader of a real sovereign nation state, which include people like Thomas More on the upper right, or Erasmus, who is not British, but very influential in Britain, and a close friend of Holbein and More and this whole humanist Platonic network. You have down here a picture of Robert Harley, who became prime minister on the bottom left of Britain during the period of Queen Anne's government, which was a period of intense battling between the Venetian party faction of Churchill, of Walpole, and these other hellfire degenerates, versus actual humanists who were trying to represent the better Shakespearean, Augustinian, Platonic traditions. This guy Robert Harley was a very high-level person who worked very closely with the person in the middle. People recognize him? Jonathan Swift. And on the bottom right, you have Sir Walter Raleigh, who is one of the earliest explorers who is tied directly to William Shakespeare, and who conducted some of the early colonization efforts of these networks to try to get away as far as possible from the corruption and moral decay of Europe into a place that had more fertility, less influenced by the tentacles of the oligarchy in the Americas, in the New World. If you look at the writings of like Thomas More of Utopia, for example, which is it's a short book, but very much worth reading. It's a very clear call for this awakening of a Promethean spirit to cross the ocean and really create a new society, a new utopia in the New World. So Walter Raleigh was one of the first to set up a colony there. It was finally the Winthrops who set up the first permanent colony that wasn't based on just, merchants going in there for money, which was something going on. But for the first time, the Winthrops were able to create a settlement process with women, children, and men going to permanently stay and create a new society that made that 1620 experience very special. And so these were the figures who Winthrop, Cotton Mather, Ben Franklin were looking to as their guides. A figure I didn't mention, or I mentioned quickly, but I didn't say very much on, was Gottfried Leibniz. And in a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of material. He comes up a lot if people actually look at the Graham Lowry book on how the nation was won. It's an invaluable piece of research. Leibniz was a force internationally, very much a Benjamin Franklin of his own right, who was a scientist, and most people only know him. I only knew of him as a scientist before I knew of any of his political works. Are people familiar on this call with Gottfried Leibniz? Yeah. Okay. So what do you think of when you think of Leibniz, scientifically speaking?
Metaphysics.
Metaphysics. Absolutely. He's a metaphysician. The principle of the best of all possible worlds is something he's attributed to. The principle of sufficient reason, that there's a pre-established harmony in nature that's in conjunction with the harmony within ourselves that allows discoveries to be made. These theories he always had, but he even writes that he wanted, he knew that his discoveries would only carry weight in terms of his political and moral and metaphysical views if he himself demonstrated that. And how did he demonstrate that? Is he organized himself to become the world's leading pioneer of mathematics and physics, and discovered the infinitesimal calculus. So he knew he had to discover something in nature to prove empirically that his theories were true. Otherwise, they're just theories. Ben Franklin was of the exact same view. Exact same view. He knew that his political ideals to change society for the better could only happen. His moral opinions could only be taken seriously if he himself demonstrated a discovery process as a living being. Now, Leibniz he was a tour de force. People who read some of LaRouche's writings will encounter Leibniz a lot. And he had been organizing an international process of nation building and civilization building that goes far beyond what most people realize today. This is from a book he wrote called, this is the English collection of Leibniz's writings on China, which he called his Novissima Sinica, his writings on China in the 1680s, 90s, where he's in collaboration with many, many priests, holy men who are doing work in China and reporting back on the nature of Mencius, Confucius, Shunxi, and many other figures, as well as analyzing the political economic systems of China. And Leibniz realizes through these writings and through these insights that the foundations for the salvation of Europe, which had fallen into corruption, are available. He also was looking at Russia. Leibniz had not only been privy counselor to Electra Sophia, who was next in line after Queen Anne to become the Queen of England of Hanover. He had helped set up academies in Berlin, internal improvements. He's the guy who fought with Denis Papin, who invented the steam engine to actually apply it for manufacturing and for boats. This is Leibniz's initiative entirely. He worked to organize Tsar Peter the Great, who he met in 1712, finally, and convinced him of his grand vision for Russia sufficiently that Peter made him a privy counselor of Russia and assigned him the sole task of reforming the legal system of Russia. He reformed the government. He took the 35 departments of the Russian government bureaucracy and cut it down to 9. And had programs laid out in detail for investigations into Russian history, language. Leibniz did speak over 12 languages conservatively. And so he was able to speak Russian fluently. He had programs for the industrialization of Russia because they were very backwater compared to all of the other European capitals. Russia was very underdeveloped at this time, and Leibniz set out whole programs for creating manufacturing, iron manufacturing, and also creating the Russian Academy of Sciences was Leibniz's baby. Leibniz was dead when Peter the Great finally put it into motion and built it, but it was Leibniz's. By following Leibniz's system, and Leibniz called himself the Solon of Russia because of the amount of responsibility he was given. He was overjoyed. Russia had quadrupled its iron smelting operations, and by the time that the American Revolution rolled around, Russia had outproduced Britain and all of continental Europe combined in iron production by following the Leibnizian protocols. Now, Leibniz didn't just see Russia as one nation, he saw all of humanity as one. And he had a program that he laid out, which you can read in his preface to his News on China, where he has a view for China-Russia relations, which I think are extra pertinent in today's world, where the Belt and Road Initiative is uniting with the Eurasian Economic Union of Russia and also extending into the Polar Silk Road. This is something which, again, is forcing reality onto the perceptions of North Americans that some elites would rather be left alone. But Leibniz wrote, "I consider a singular plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, in the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps Supreme Providence has ordained such an arrangement, so that as the most cultivated and distant peoples stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may be gradually brought to a better way of life." I do not think it an accident that the Russians, whose vast realm connects Europe with China and who hold sway over the deep barbarian lands of the north, by the shore of the frozen ocean, should be led to the emulation of our ways through the strenuous efforts of their present ruler. So this guy was a real thorn and nightmare for the oligarchy, because every time that they thought that they would like stifle a fire that Leibniz was lighting for Promethean change within, whether it was Berlin or whether it was in England itself, where Leibniz's allies, like I mentioned, Robert Harley, Jonathan Swift, who were parts of Queen Anne's administration, every time that they were disrupted or overthrown, he would pop up with a completely new grand design in another part of the world that they didn't control, and he would do this all throughout his life. And again, his discoveries and his ability to coordinate scientists to his cause is something that was only seen again with Benjamin Franklin. I mentioned here, so Leibniz dies in 1717. At this time, Ben Franklin is only, he's 10 years old when Leibniz dies. And when Leibniz dies, like I said, Walpole and Bernard Mandeville completely take over, and the humanist movement within England that was encouraging the independence and the growth of the colonies is destroyed. London turns into a usurious, bankrupt basket case under the control of the Hellfire clubs. And George I is brought in. And see, here's the thing. Queen Anne dies in an interesting moment because, as I said, Electra Sophia, is an important idea to keep in mind. She is the student of Leibniz. She's also the second in line of the Hanoverian throne to England after Anne. When Sophie, who's a little old at this time, dies, within weeks, Anne dies as well. So Anne was being kept alive largely just to block Sophia, because if Sophia was made the queen, Leibniz would have come to England as well and would have been a direct power broker at that time, probably Prime Minister of England, at a very sensitive time when Venice and their outpost within Amsterdam had put a lot of effort into taking over England. And as I said, this had happened with the 1688 Glorious Revolution and the transplanting of the private Bank of Amsterdam into England with the creation of the Bank of England. People like Isaac Newton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, or not Secretary, he was the Treasurer of the Mint of the Bank of England. he was a direct enemy of Leibniz. His discoveries largely weren't discoveries, but rather just knockoffs. There were thefts of things like the calculus, like gravity, that were made by Kepler, Leibniz, or Huygens on optics. This guy was a direct, like I said, an enemy of Leibniz. Leibniz spent a lot of his life absorbed in an unnecessary amount of writing and debating to try to break people free of the Newton cult that was being elevated to sort of say this guy Newton just discovered these things by having apples fall on his head. No thinking needed. He was also an enemy of John Locke. John Locke being part of this Hellfire network and a leader of the Board of Trade of England that argued for destroying manufacturers in the British colonies of the Americas. Locke also argued for slavery, that was the way to go, not industry. And it was known at this time very clearly that you had two choices. Either you go for manufacturing and internal improvements, or you have a society of usury and slavery. There's, you can make money with both options, but one doesn't have a future and one is highly immoral. Okay, Bernard Mandeville, I brought him up a few times. In his Fable of the Beast, so this guy's philosophy, which is a precursor to Adam Smith later on, has the thesis, which is a little controversial of its day, but it becomes the standard philosophy of the governance of England at this time. And he's the soul of the Hellfire Clubs, as Ben Franklin got to meet him in 1725. In his Fable of the Bees, he writes on how public virtue is the creation of private vices. That's actually the subheading of it. He describes his view of virtue and morality. That's a picture of low-res picture of Bernard Mandeville. He's probably touching himself outside of that picture. Where he writes, "Have a frugal and honest society. The best policy is to preserve men in their native simplicity. Strive not to increase their numbers. Let them never be acquainted with strangers or superfluities, but remove and keep from them everything that might raise their desires or improve their understanding." This is his advice to the governance of a nation. What should the governors do? Never encourage things that might improve people's understanding or raise their desires for something other than what a talking cow might want. And don't increase their numbers, right? Great wealth and great treasure will ever scorn to come among men, unless you'll admit their inseparable companions, avarice and luxury. Where trade is considerable, fraud will intrude. To be at once well-bred and sincere is no less than a contradiction. And therefore, while man advances in knowledge and his manners are polished, we must expect to see at the same time his desires enlarged, his appetites refined, and his vices increased. So this is Mandeville's view of the refined man, the refined elite, who must naturally see his desires enlarged and his vices must by nature, natural law, increase. And again, when you actually read some of this Fable of the Bees, and it's not that big from what I've looked at, he's really making the point that value does come by just letting everybody, not by allowing all of the peasants to be full of vice, but you have to encourage vice. Because he makes the point, well, look at the highwayman, the robber, who might kill a guy. That's, you could say, is our convention says it's bad, but he kills the guy, takes his money, and goes to town. He might get a prostitute. You could say our conventions say getting the prostitute is bad, using the money of the dead guy he stole it from. But he's going to pay that prostitute money, and what's she going to do? Well, she's going to buy new buttons for her blouse. That's going to put somebody to work. Someone's going to make that button. So that's going to cultivate industry. And thus, that's a virtuous thing, industry, isn't it? We all want that. So private vices, if left to their, unregulated desires, create public macro virtues. If you look at anybody who's looked at Adam Smith and the theory of Smith's marketplace and where does value arise under a deregulated market, it's largely by everybody pursuing their own self-interest, their own pleasure, right? You maximize your pleasure and you avoid pain. and somehow progress happens. Great. But now let's compare it to Leibniz. By the way, if there's anybody who I can't see messages, so if people do send chats, if it's valid to what I'm saying, break in. Just say it aloud if anybody says it, because I can't see my chats right now. Is there anything that I saw some people wanted to say something? No?
Yeah, Lionel was saying something.
Oh, okay. What was it?
Oh, it's nothing really that pertinent. I'm just sort of talking to the audience, really.
Okay. All right.
Just
I wasn't sure. All right. If it's something that is pertinent, though, just chime in. And otherwise, I guess we'll just bring it for the Q&A flow discussion at the end. Okay. So just take what Mandeville just said. Hellfire Club Mandeville, and now compare it to a slightly more, I think, ennobled sense of happiness and virtue and pleasure. Is it just something that, So Leibniz, in his New Essays on Human Understanding, which he wrote in refutation to John Locke, he wrote, "I do not know whether the greatest pleasure is possible. I believe rather that it can grow ad infinitum. I believe then that happiness is a lasting pleasure, which could not be so without there being a continual progress to new pleasures. Happiness is then, so to speak, a road through pleasures, and pleasure is merely a step and an advancement towards happiness, the shortest which can be made according to the present impressions, but not always the best. The right road may be missed in the desire to follow the shortest, as the stone which goes straight may encounter obstacles too soon, which prevent it from advancing quite to the center of the earth. This shows that it is the reason and the will which transport us towards happiness, but that feeling and desire merely lead us to pleasure." So he's already differentiating happiness and pleasure, right? These are not to be confused. And some forms of pleasure are actually false, because you think you're taking the shortest route, but you're actually missing the right path. So it's not so evident that all pleasures are created equal, as a Mandeville might say. He goes on and says, "True happiness ought always to be the object of our desires, but there is ground for doubting whether it is. For often we hardly think of it, and I have remarked here more than once that the less desire is guided by reason, the more it tends to present pleasure and not to happiness, that is to say, to lasting pleasure." And that's super profound for me. Hopefully you guys think, okay, I'm seeing by the nodding of the heads that this makes sense. Yeah, so I mean, you can't confuse present pleasure with happiness or lasting pleasure, because sometimes you give into a pleasure now and you have regret later. You're like, why did I eat that? It seemed like a good idea at the time. And now you have regret, or whatever, name a vice. They're vices because they're seductive and because they give a momentary pleasure, but at the cost of something greater. And your happiness suffers for that.
His doubt as well that happiness is even the right object. That's fascinating. And he just leaves that there.
He goes on. I mean, this is out of context from his book, and you can get the whole essay New Essay on Human Understanding, which is written as a Platonic dialogue. Actually, it's not written, whereas Locke's is written as an Aristotelian treatise. Leibniz's is written as a dialogue, which is, I think, also a very interesting part of this dispute between the nature of mind as a static thing that fixates on logic and nouns and syllogisms, versus an art of posing questions, fruitful questions. Right. So Leibniz is definitely on the side of the art of posing fruitful questions, and ties the idea of happiness to that process. It's a process orientation. On the issue of the good, in the same work, I thought I would just point out, because we're talking about it, keeping in mind also some of the lessons Dave delivered in the lecture last Sunday on Dante Alighieri and his work on De Monarchia, on the nature of a good state. And the idea of natural law, that man's law is good to the degree that it coincides with the law of God, the law of nature, and it's bad to the degree that it acts in defiance to the laws of nature. Leibniz points out that to contribute to the public good and to the glory of God is the same thing. It seems that the aim of all mankind should chiefly be nothing other than the knowledge and development of the wonders of God, and that it is for this reason that God has given to humankind dominion over the globe. So if humankind tries to, in Leibniz's world, exercise dominion without that condition first met of glory, wonder, and goodness, it's not legitimate. You're just becoming an imperialist, subduing or enforcing artificially nature to bend, but not actually doing anything that is in the mandate of heaven. Back to our list. So this is the process that, as I mentioned, Cotton Mather, with his Essays to Do Good, is highly saturated and influenced by this. Mather is also a leading scientist, an astronomer, a physicist. He's published 500 works in his lifetime to his name. It's remarkably bountiful. So Mather, who had recruited Ben Franklin, who had done this work, they have a cultural battle on their hands to undo the mentally and morally crippling effects of the printing presses of their day, like James Franklin, Ben Franklin's brother, and the Hellfire Club agenda within the colonies. So when Ben Franklin gets back, he sets up a massive printing press in Pennsylvania and founds the Pennsylvania Gazette, which quickly becomes the most popular and widely published gazette. It's not just for news, though. There's philosophy, there's political history, there's science in there. It's not like your today's newspaper. He also begins quickly printing Poor Richard's Almanac from 1733 to 59. During the same time of 1729 when he gets back, and this is all as part of the uplifting of the minds of the people, because you cannot have at this time an America representing the type of change for the British Empire that he desires and knows must happen. It's just not there. They don't have the ability yet at that stage. So his life is devoted to uplifting the creative, cognitive, moral powers of the society. And you can sort of look, and we will shortly here, at his works that are tuned to that. But in 1729, he writes on the necessity of a paper currency, which establishes colonial scrip. This is something I have written down here. Oh, I lost it. But, oh, no, I don't. Here, actually, here. Okay, so on colonial scrip, he makes a point in 1729. People are wondering why America is able to do things that Britain is not able to. They still don't have slaves, you know, like Britain is flooding slaves into the Americas, mostly being absorbed into Spanish America at this time. Most of the colonies they find slavery reprehensible, and they're passing laws in their legislatures prohibiting slavery. Every single colony during this time passed laws preventing slavery, and they were always subverted by the British Parliament that said, no, you're going to get slavery, because Royal Africa Company, right? Part of the British East India Company empire was the Royal Africa Company, on whose board sat John Locke. And they made their money with the Spanish based on the Treaty of Utrecht from 1713 all the way to the 1750s, supplying Spain in the Americas with all of their black slaves from Africa. 6 million were imported by the British government against the will largely of the greatest of American patriots. And they flooded into the colonies because Britain always wanted to force the colonies they wanted to break their manufacturing and force them into a slave addiction. That was always the idea, to keep them subdued the way Mandeville described good peasants should be under an elite. But at this time, 1729, Ben Franklin writes, we have no poorhouses, no places where you arrest poor people who are in debt and put them to work. He says, we have none of those in the colonies, and if we had some, there would be nobody to put them in. Since there is in the colonies not a single unemployed person, neither beggars nor tramps. In the colonies, we issue our own paper money. It is called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to make the goods and pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating ourselves our own paper money. We control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to anyone. This is completely pissing off the City of London financiers, who have been working with the Dutch and others to keep America, to bring them into the usurious controls of the European banking powers. But because of colonial scrip, they can't do it. And in Ben Franklin's paper, he does make a case that value is not located in money per se, or in gold, or in a thing. It's located in something more. And this is based on his understanding of what Leibniz did on economics, as well as what Colbert did on his dirigistic policies in France after the 30 Years' War. This is a precursor to what later became the American system of economics under Alexander Hamilton. I mentioned Poor Richard's Almanac. I thought it would be fun here. I found, just to get a sense, Ben Franklin's approach changes the language. He gives people a greater mental infrastructure, a poetic infrastructure, and he is a poet, even though he's known as a scientist and a musician. He's a poet who creates content that only Shakespeare did in terms of the influence on changing the language. If you look at how many things Shakespeare contributed through his works that influenced the English language, Ben Franklin's work in Poor Richard's Almanac was somewhat similar, and things we take for granted as things, you know, we sort of say without thinking of its origins, like honesty is the best policy. That's Ben Franklin. Just to read a few of them here. Nick, you want to read them?
Sure. Content makes poor men rich. Discontent makes rich men poor. Investment in knowledge pays the best interest. Well done is better than well said. A house is not a home unless it contains food and fire for the mind as well as the body. Honesty is the best policy. You may delay, but time will not. Wine is constant proof that God loves us and loves to see us happy. Never leave that till tomorrow which you can do today. By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty or safety. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. Either write something worth reading or do something worth writing. Be at war with your vices, at peace with your neighbors, and let every new year find you a better man. It is the first responsibility of every citizen to question authority. And last, hide not your talents, they for use were made. What's a sundial in the shade?
I love that. So he was able to take things that you would write a treatise on and encapsulate them into these poetic adages. Thomas More did this as well with his educational reforms, and so did Erasmus, actually, if you look at what they were doing in England. But it had an incredible effect on tuning the souls of the people of the Americas. Go back to our list here. All right. So he authored a proposal for the promotion of useful knowledge, to create what is said in the founding document: one society to be formed of virtuosi or ingenious men residing in the several colonies, to be called the American Philosophical Society, who are to remain in constant correspondence. These committees of correspondences were also tied internationally to Europe, to Russia, and beyond. We'll see a little bit more about that. He discovered electricity in 1752 and was appointed Postmaster General of the Americas. As I said earlier, he created Canada's post office in Halifax and extended it to Quebec City and Montreal in 1763. He was the very first person at the beginning of the French Indian Wars in 1754 to propose a plan of union to unite the 13 colonies, which was adopted by the Albany Congress but was not ratified by the other colonies. This was a vitally important idea. The join or die logo with the snake cut up in pieces actually does not come from the American Revolution. It came from this fight in 1754. He's appointed Pennsylvania ambassador to England, where he organizes the British Lunar Society of great British scientists and industrialists who actually undo, in large measure, the destructive effects of the City of London, the Bank of England, and Walpole's government policy by investing into internal improvements, roads, canals, water management, education, and industry and steam power. So the thing Leibniz had been fighting for, applying steam power, was largely done by the Lunar Society of England, that brought England into a manufacturing powerhouse. It wasn't on their own terms that they were able to do that. The oligarchy was not able to organize themselves that way. And this was all during the time when Ben Franklin was still trying to reform Britain. He was not decided upon creating a revolution at this time. He didn't think that it was absolutely necessary. In 1760, for Canadians, the reason why Canada became taken by the British was largely because of Ben Franklin. The consensus at that time during the 7 Years' War with the French was that should the opportunity arise, they should take Guadeloupe, the French possessions in the Indies, which were more valuable financially because of the rum and the sugar, compared to the furs that were being produced by Quebec, which was financially a fraction of what Guadeloupe was creating. Franklin made the point in his Canada pamphlets when he was in London that no, it's the potential you want to look at. You don't want to look at just the money. And he organized so vociferously for this that it actually succeeded in turning the tide of opinion, where they did choose to end up taking Quebec as part of the British successes against the French in that 7 Years' War in 1763. But it became evident by the late and early 1770s that Britain was not going to reform itself, and he at this point put all of his efforts into revolution. So the Continental Congress was largely his brainchild, and the name implies Continental Congress. Most of America was not British colonies. The 13 colonies were maybe like 2% of the territory of the Americas. The rest of it was Hudson Bay land, private territory that we saw in my last class. It was Spanish territory and a bit of Russia. Mostly warring imperial states of Europe had control of most of the territories. And the problem was because of the French Jesuits, and not all Jesuits are bad, but the Jesuitical policy has poison from the top. And a program was created over generations from the 17th century up till Ben Franklin's time of inducing natives of the Canadas, the Mohawks, the Algonquins, and others, to act as agents of the Jesuitical sort of war program. They became sort of deployed as tools to conduct raids on the colonists. So not all natives fell for this. The Iroquois did generally much better. So did the Cherokee. They tended not to fall for this stuff. But this was a factor that complicated things a lot. So the Continental Congress was always the idea of a new Thomas More's utopia, right? Like a new, and that doesn't mean a perfect finished state, but a nation, a new culture in the Americas. He was made commissioner of Canada.
Can I ask something?
Oh, of course you can, man.
Just generally, how did the Jesuits convince those tribes to do that?
If you read Frederick Schiller's Jesuit government in Paraguay lecture, there's a transcript of that we have up on our website. Frederick Schiller conducted a large study that he expressed in this one lecture that went through documentation of these two Jesuits that were caught passing themselves off as sort of like angels by synthetically creating quasi-Christian, quasi-native mythology synthetic religions. They were able to induce the Jesuits of Paraguay to basically be basically carry out attacks against white people. I don't want to make it about race or anything because it's not, but they were found with instructions and a code on their garb that was then deciphered and publicized in Europe. And Schiller thought this was fascinating. There's similar things in Canada. They're very good, the Jesuits, at covering their tracks, but you find a lot of it in the cracks. The Jesuits were also accused at various times of carrying out poisonings and assassinations of major European statesmen. That's why they were banned in Spain in the 18th century. They were banned in France under Louis XV, who then died very quickly after. That's a whole discussion we can have in the Q&A, I think. It's something I've only begun looking into in a serious way, so I don't have like the full answer, but there's something seriously wrong there.
It sounds eerily like late Chinese history as well. So.
Okay, let's go back to that after. Okay, so As I said in the beginning of the class, he was made a commissioner to Canada to convince the Canadians between April and May to join and become a signer of the Declaration of Independence. That didn't work, and I still didn't say why that didn't work yet, but I will. So when that mission failed, and the Quebecois decided to stay loyal to the Crown, he led a 4-man committee to draft the Declaration of Independence, which was publicized on July 4th. Right afterwards, he was made the ambassador to France, and thank God that he was. That was probably the smartest thing imaginable, because at that point, he was able to organize, here at the bottom, the Treaty of Alliance with France, which changed everything, because I think that if you're looking at America from the first 2 years of the revolution, there was no chance that they were going to succeed in anything that they were doing. There was just no way. But by getting France to join into the US cause, it changed everything in so many nonlinear ways. And I'm going to say a few of those ways in a moment. He also established the Treaty of Paris to get a peace finally in 1783. And as I said earlier, the US Constitution, he was a key leader in drafting that, especially the preamble on the general welfare, which gives meaning to everything else. Everything has to be read from the preamble, or else it's relatively, it's just legalistic at that point. I didn't say, we have an article on our website on the Confucian roots of Ben Franklin. Many of David Wong, who's a professor in the United States, wrote a wonderful paper that we were happy to publish, going through Ben Franklin's studies of Confucianism, Mencius. So he really took Leibniz's path very seriously, and he wrote several documents extolling the praises of the Chinese civilization and political system, and many of the virtues that he puts into his program for self-improvement of the young and the Poor Rich's Almanac, they actually derive directly from Confucius and the teachings that are recorded in Mencius. David Wang's paper is really good, and I'll make that available in our document. He also makes the case that there's certain practices of meritocracy that have a lot of merit that he thinks a new American government should apply, and he's writing this as early as the 1750s. Okay, so this touches now, I brought up China, I brought up some of the French aspect. America was never about 13 colonies not wanting to pay taxes. It was not about tea parties. That was not what it was about. The idea of taxation with representation was just number, I think, 20 of 29 of the points on the Declaration of Independence. It was one of the minimal ones. It wasn't the top in any way. But the American experience and the revolution was an international process and can't be understood otherwise. And it was supposed to, after being successful in America, return back internationally to liberate the world from systems of hereditary rule. That's vital. On the left here, that's Marquis de Lafayette, young 19-year-old statesman who came in early on, even before France had formally joined with the American cause. He had already come in with a group of hot-headed but very moral patriots to risk his life and fight with Washington. To the middle there, you have Thaddeus Kosciuszko, and further over, von Steuben. So you have Wilhelm von Steuben, who is the Inspector General of the Continental Army from Prussia. Frederick the Great is an early proponent of the American cause, and his support for the American process encouraged a vast wave of Prussian generals, soldiers, statesmen to come into America and help organize the farmers who really didn't have that much military training to discipline them. And von Steuben wrote the first training manual for American troops. Kosciuszko from Poland became a leading figure who came very close to organizing a successful Republican revolution against the Russian Empire in the late, in the 1804-1806 period. Marquis de Lafayette was the leader of the French Revolutionary cause and narrowly escaped with his head when the Jacobins took over. That story again is in my paper on the French Revolution as a color revolution. But it's not just that, because we have here Russia. Like I said, the American cause would not have been a success were it not for the League of Armed Neutrality, which was organized in 1780 by Tsarina Catherine the Great, who's there on the left. This was very important because in a very short time, it involved the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, and Prussia officially joining the League of Armed Neutrality, ensuring that supplies were able to get from Europe, from Russia, to the Americas without the British intervening on the high waters of seas, stopping it. So that was very important. Otherwise, that would have been seen as an act of war. This was a huge moralizing influence and supplied the Americans with vital supplies and munitions that they needed to carry out the battle against the biggest empire in the world. People probably don't know the young woman to your right. She was a bit new to me. Cynthia, in her last work on Russia and America, first introduced her to me. This is Ekaterina Dashkova. Ekaterina Dashkova meets Benjamin Franklin in France in 1780, and she's the younger sister of Catherine the Great. She calls herself Catherine the Small. And what makes her especially interesting is that she's the first woman to be the head of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So after meeting Ben Franklin, they become close friends, and she plays a role in making the League of Armed Neutrality happen, along with some other colleagues of Ben Franklin in Russia. She inducts Ben Franklin to become the first American in the Russian Academy of Sciences, which was set up by Leibniz originally, keep that in mind. And she, in turn, is made the first Russian member of Benjamin Franklin's Philosophical Society. I think that's just beautiful. So that's another aspect of this thing. But it doesn't end there, because let's get out of Europe. In India, you have Hyder Ali. That's a picture of Hyder Ali with Admiral Suffren of France, who in 1780 organizes the Mysore Rebellion in southern India. He's an Islamic Indian leader, and he and his son Tipu Sultan conduct a massive raid on a British-controlled fort at St. George near the port. It's a port town of Madras. And this thing is so big that Britain has to redirect about 20% of its naval forces to try to fight Hyder Ali during this 2-year battle. And Hyder Ali, there's these wonderful paintings where he's the first to innovate the use of rockets, where you got these like strict formations, tight formations of British soldiers, fighting by the book and being just destroyed by Indian rockets. It's just like tearing them to shreds. So 20% of the British fleet is now directed that cannot now fight in the Americas or stop the French from helping the American cause. And Hyder Ali's son, Tipu Sultan, writes to the Congress saying, he writes a message in 1781 to the Continental Congress saying, every blow that is struck in the cause of American liberty throughout the world, in France, India, and elsewhere, and so long as a single insolent tyrant remains, the struggle shall continue. Britain never forgave India for this. They had a long way still to go before they actually gained control of India, but Hyder Ali had defeated them already in 1760, had kicked their ass repeatedly in this Mysore Rebellion, and it was still quite some years before Britain was able to finally take hold of India and promptly rape it, which it's continued to do largely to the current age today that we live in. Emperor Sidi Muhammad of Morocco. This is another, and I'm going to end here as far as international aspects, but again, largely because the French and the French connection that Ben Franklin organized, you had Emperor Sidi Muhammad, who was able to initiate a treaty of support with the American cause. The Barbary pirates of Tunisia, Algiers, these were called Barbary pirates, and basically they had a little alliance with the British Empire to receive intel on when American ships were going to be passing through a certain region of the waters of the Straits of Gibraltar, and basically destroy them, attack them. Emperor Sidi came out openly supporting the American cause, saying to them that he would supply, and he did, end up supplying protection off the coast of Morocco to all American ships. And I think that's George Washington ended up writing a letter of thanks to him much later on for that work, which did play a very important strategic role in the larger fight. Also, I didn't point out that the biggest American naval ship that won some major battles against the British was named the Hyder Ali in 1782. Okay, so this is an international struggle. As I pointed out, and as Schiller noted, had the color revolution of France not succeeded and the Jacobins not turned that into a bloodbath, killing all of their Republican leaders as well as the corrupt aristocracy alike, shouting the revolution needs no scientists. Had that not happened, people like Schiller, Mozart, Beethoven later, leading scientists and artists were part of processes that were ready to install similar forms of Republican movements across Europe to get rid of the Spanish, Spanish, French, and all European monarchical hereditary systems. And it was tied to the artistic movement too. It wasn't just political. That's very important as a theme here. Back to Quebec before I end this. So why didn't Quebec accept the offer? They had the sympathy of the masses of the Quebecois, felt sympathetic to the Americans. They were certainly wronged by the British a lot. They didn't have a lot of freedoms. So what happened? Well, what you see is two maps, right? On the left is Quebec after the British won the 7 Years' War. Quebec is very small. You have the Hudson Bay Company land above. Quebec is a very small little narrow strip around the St. Lawrence, extending to the opening. The rest of it, even Nova Scotia, it's a separate colony. The British colonies are another thing. It's not big. And then the First Nations territories are everywhere. What happened is that the British foresaw that Quebec was likely going to join the American cause. There was little that they could do to stop that except the Quebec Act of 1774. And so what you see is a vast increase of Quebec territory stretching all the way down to the Ohio River on the southernmost side. Native territory, First Nations territory is diminished, but now you have Jesuitical control of also natives that is being used to carry out more attacks all the way down through to the southern parts of the British colonies. This is a big deal. So on the one hand, the territories are increased, but they're increased also with some freedoms. So Britain gives certain liberties to the Quebecois, saying, okay, you can keep your language, you can keep your local religious controls. We're going to let your local churches continue to reap the financial harvests of the seigneuries and to continue to take the tithes. We won't influence any of that. But all you have to do to get these freedoms is stay loyal to the crown and forever give up the idea of elective assembly. That's all you have to do. And so it actually ends up working. Bishop Jean-Olivier Briand writes, "The God of armies who extends or restricts at his pleasure the boundaries of empires, having by his eternal decrees put us under the domination of his Britannic Majesty, it is our duty based on natural law to be interested in all that concerns him. We order you to submit to the king and to all those who share his authority." So there's the head bishop of all of Quebec who's now giving a command to all of the local churches around which the entire Quebec society is based, is through these little churches, that they are to now obey the crown. More than that, for those Quebecois farmers who might still feel an inkling or a desire to join in the rebellion of the colonists, they will burn in hellfire. So he also passes an excommunication act stating that anybody who's to work with Washington or Franklin will now be kicked out of the church and thus burn in hellfire forever, which obviously in a very religious society, very low on literacy. Not a lot of the population was literate at those days. Very much different from the American, what's called the Latin farmer. The American farmers could read their own Bible. They could often read Latin, Greek. The practice of reading, the classics was widespread amongst the colonies. So that was very different in Quebec, which still had the French feudal system, where human beings were told to stay as dumb as Adam and Eve was before they ate from the garden, from the tree of knowledge, and started sin by asking questions and seeking knowledge. So that was the way that local controls worked, and that is what was submitted to. I would say that not everybody gave into that. There was about 200 Quebecois patriots who did leave and joined Washington under Clement Gosselin, who was he was named George Washington's French-Canadian spy, who settled in America after the war was over. And it wasn't all, they didn't all just cave in, but a lot of them did. And the effects of that were, as I said, Canada remaining British, the United Empire Loyalists that gave birth to the Family Compact. Later on, that's what the name was given by William Lyon Mackenzie in Upper Canada. These English-speaking Canadians that settled in Upper Canada, modern Ontario, created an element of the later deep state. The French aristocracy, or the families of France, of the nobility in New Quebec, had their own fight to try to stop lovers of freedom like Louis Joseph Papineau. His father, even Fleury Meplat, when he got out of prison and founded the Montreal Gazette, were still leaders of a certain Republican heritage that is not to be dismissed or forgotten. But it was a society organized by the rule of the stronger and hereditary rights, very much in opposition to what Schiller talks about in his Lycurgus and Sparta paper that we cited at the beginning. So to end, the lesson here from Ben Franklin, I think, for those who should have known better in Quebec, is those who would sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither. I'll just end it there.